Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 64 and I am the show's host Kyle. Today I'm joined again by Will Porter. Will is a journalist and commentator with a focus on U.S. foreign policy and Mideast affairs. He is a staff writer at the Daily Sheeple and some of his work can be found at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. How you doing, Will?
I'm great, Kyle. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
I'm good. It's exciting to have you on. We got some cool topics to discuss today. We are going to talk first about the Syria situation and a little bit about the chemical weapons attacks that have been going on there, and then U.S. claims about it, and we have some new articles coming out. So why don't you just kind of quickly remind us what happened on April 4th? We've talked about this a few times on my show, so you don't have to go into a lot of detail, but just enough to give us a general idea. Remind us.
Sure. Yeah, I can try to summarize that for us. So on the morning of April 4th, in a town in the Idlib province called Khan Sheikhoun, the Syrian government carried out a bombing on a rebel command post, where several leaders from al-Nusra and Arar al-Sham and other Islamist factions were expected to meet. And these are supposed to be high-value targets. And so Russian intelligence had confirmed this meeting, and actually according to Seymour Hersh, a journalist, who we can get into his reporting shortly, he said the Russians shared this information with the Americans, and the Americans said it was good. But within hours of that strike, the world's media was accusing the Syrian government of carrying out a chemical weapons attack on civilians. And so that's basically what happened on April 4th.
All right, and so what was the U.S. immediate response to what happened at Khan Sheikhoun?
Yeah, so within a few days of the April 4th incident, the Trump administration decided to launch a retaliatory missile strike, and they fired 59 Tomahawk missiles at the Shayrat airfield. This is a base that the Syrians use for the Khan Sheikhoun airstrike. And apparently it didn't do much to the airfield, and the Syrians were flying sorties out of the base the next day, but that was the response.
All right, and I don't know if you had a chance to listen to that interview with Thaddeus Russell and the refugee from Syria. That was posted in the Foreign Policy Focus group. But in that interview, they were talking about how in Syria, a lot of people are obligated to join the military and really don't have a choice. And so when the U.S., even the government claimed that they're just carrying out this strike against, the evil Assad army, really these people are just innocent civilians who have to be where they are.
Right. I haven't actually heard that interview yet. It's on my list, though.
All right. Yeah, it's a good one. For those of you who are in the private Facebook group, you'll know that one of the members posted that interview. Thaddeus Russell and a Syrian refugee gives his take on the situation. All right. And so we have a recent article from Seymour Hersh out on the chemical weapons attack. What did the Hersh article add to the narrative of the Syrian weapons attack on April 4th?
Yeah, so we're referring to a piece published on June 25th called Trump's Red Line. And this is written by Seymour Hersh, and he's sort of a veteran investigative reporter. And Hersh gave us a lot of basic details that we actually hadn't known previously. The Russian intelligence sharing, for example, where the Russians told the Americans about their plan to strike this command center. And actually the nature of the command center and the target in the first place. We didn't really know about that before the Hersh report. The Hersh piece also goes into the administration's decision-making process, and he describes a situation where President Trump is kind of heart-set on a military response, and even after his advisors told him there was really no good evidence that the Syrian regime carried out a chemical attack. And Hersh says Trump was given several options ranging from doing nothing to an outright, assassination of Assad, and fortunately Trump picked one of the middle options, but Hersh claims also that the limited damage done to the Shayrat airfield was done on purpose as a way to limit the damage done to our relations with the Russians. So it's kind of funny. They're trying to foil Trump's, he was heart set on a military response, and they're trying to kind of do damage control with that. However, the most important aspect of this piece, I think, is the flat rejection of the administration's narrative. Hersh's source, who is a senior military and intelligence advisor, says in no uncertain terms that the incident in Khan Sheikhoun was not a regime chemical attack. And he said that was actually a fantasy, that idea. Hersh actually provided a brief transcript to Die Welt, and that's a German newspaper. Maybe we can kind of get into why Hersh has to publish his stuff in the foreign press a little later. But Hersh provided this transcript of a conversation between a security advisor and an active duty American soldier, and it's very clear from this conversation that neither of these guys believed the Syrian regime carried out a chemical attack. And at one point, the soldier says that the Russians are angry because they think the U.S. knows what really happened and that we're hiding it, and the soldier says they are correct. So I think these are the most important aspects of Hersh's piece.
All right. And how does that Seymour Hersh piece tie into reporting from Phil Girardi and Gareth Porter?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with Phil here because his is much more straightforward, his piece of the story. So a former CIA and Army intelligence officer named Phil Giraldi told a radio show host named Scott Horton on April 6th, this is actually just hours before the Tomahawk retaliation strike, but Giraldi said that his military and intelligence sources were freaking out about how the administration was presenting the Khan Sheikhoun incident. And he said his sources knew for a fact that it was a strike with a conventional munition and not a G-shell using sarin or any nerve agent. And so in that interview, Giraldi said that his intelligence is very clear on this aspect of the story. And Hersh's source says the same exact thing as what Giraldi said. And so that seems pretty consistent. Now, regarding Gareth Porter's work, in particular a piece called New Revelations Belie Trump Claims on Syria Chemical Attack, and this is published at Truthout on April 13th. But Gareth Porter theorized that the cloud of poisonous gas at Khan Sheikhoun was created by a certain type of smoke munition known to be used and stocked by the rebels. And Gareth is suggesting that the Syrian strike on Khan Sheikhoun accidentally hit a cache of these munitions and produced a cloud of what is known as phosphine gas. And this is actually a toxic chemical that's very similar to sarin because it affects a similar enzyme in the human body. And Gareth Porter actually cited an eyewitness at the scene who said that they could smell garlic or rotting food, which is very consistent with how phosphine gas is supposed to smell, whereas sarin, especially military-grade sarin, is supposed to be odorless. So that was a theory offered by a journalist named Gareth Porter. And so the small little connection that I've added in my own reporting is simply the fact that certain types of fertilizer can also produce phosphine gas, not only these smoke munitions. And Hersh in his report said that fertilizers indeed were stored at the site of the Khan Sheikhoun attack, or strike. He said that fertilizers as well as chlorine-based disinfectants, so there's a lot of heavy-duty chemicals stored there. So Gareth Porter may have been right about the phosphine gas angle, and now we know there are several ways that it could have been released. And finally, to be clear, we don't actually know for a fact where the plume of gas came from or what exactly it was, but there are other plausible explanations other than a Syrian regime chemical attack.
Wow, really great stuff. Well, I mean, you put a lot of different information together there to give us kind of a picture of what probably happened here. And so, does this seem to you that if you were, had to say that you think this is what happened on that day, that was the phosphine gas cloud caused by a 500-pound Syrian bomb dropped on the location?
Yeah, I tend to think that is currently, at least, that seems to fit all the evidence and information we have. And now, I do think Gareth Porter, he's told me he has a new lead on this phosphine angle, so we may be seeing some new reporting on that fairly soon.
All right, everyone. Well, keep an eye out for anything written by Gareth Porter. Gareth. All right, thanks, Will. And now we're going to talk about another article you wrote, and that was on Trump warning to Assad about Assad launching another chemical weapons attack. So why don't you tell us about that warning, what Trump said, and what's important about it?
Sure. The White House came out, I forget the exact date of this warning, I believe a couple weeks ago, came out and said the Syrian government was planning a new chemical weapons attack. And just a couple days after that, actually, though, Secretary of Defense James Mattis comes out and says that the plot has been foiled. And so it's a little reassuring he's saying that there's no longer a plot. But for a minute there, it looked like they were kind of cooking up a narrative to blame something on the Syrian government. The UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, actually tweeted about how, if there's any attacks on Syrian civilians, we're going to blame Russia and Iran as well. So that was kind of frightening, that brief period of time when they seemed like they were cooking up a narrative. And of course, the Russians responded with a few of their own statements and, making the expected threats of retaliation.
Yeah, that Haley tweet I thought was the most amazing part of this story. It seemed to me to be a green light to the Syrian rebels that if you carry out a false flag, we'll believe it. I mean, she said any Syrian or any weapons attack in Syria is going to be blamed on the Syrian regime. So if you're the Syrian rebels, that seems like a good way to get the U.S. to fight your war for you.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, do you have anything else on that story or about the Syria situation in general that you would like to tell us about?
Yeah, one little detail I'd like to include about the prior story was that the White House came out with this warning, but shortly after, officials from the Pentagon and the State Department came out saying they had no idea what the White House is talking about. And so that, I don't actually know for a fact that this warning was based on absolutely nothing, but that fact is very fishy. It makes me think the White House was really just kind of coming up with this without the Pentagon or the State Department. It's very strange. You'd think they would have known about it. However, regarding larger news related to Syria in general, on Sunday there was a ceasefire that's actually been implemented in southwestern Syria. And so that seems promising. It appears to be holding. Rebel factions are even saying that it's holding. And this is coming just in time for a new round of talks in Geneva, where they're going to discuss a lot of important things like this, changes to the Syrian constitution, elections, fighting terrorism, etc. So there's going to be a lot of, well, we hope at least there'll be some movement on the Syria issue within the coming weeks.
Finally, we're getting some good news, it sounds like. I will say on that story about the Pentagon and other officials not knowing, I had heard that only top officials knew, and so it was just like Mattis and Tillerson who had a hand in crafting the language of that letter or that warning the day of, and nobody else knew about it, and that was why. But the story you cited, I believe, was written by Nancy Youssef, who does have some credibility. So maybe that's just the White House trying to cover their tracks on this one.
Sure, it could be spin, or it could certainly be true that these were lower level officials who wouldn't have any reason to know anyway. So I guess that's important to include.
Yeah, because I thought the important note was just that it sounded like from at least that story that Tillerson and Mattis kind of had Trump make the statement less hawkish rather than more hawkish. So,
right.
All right, and then now the second thing I want to talk about with you today, and that is news sources. I don't know about you, Will, but one of the first things anybody asks me is always, where do you get your news? How do you know this? And all that kind of stuff. Do you get that quite a bit?
Yeah, absolutely, all the time.
All right, and so one of the first questions everybody asks is just, where do you find your news? So, Will, how do you find your news?
Well, I can kind of there's so many places, but I can kind of at least run down my routine, at least my sort of daily routine.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
And so most days I begin at a site called antiwar.com, which I'm sure your viewers are probably familiar with. And there you can just get a great roundup of foreign policy news, and it's written in the form of little news briefs, so you can kind of quickly scan over all the headlines for the day. And I think that's great for just keeping up with all the major stories. Now, you don't always get a ton of detail in the antiwar.com write-ups, but it's a good starting point just to see what stories have broken on any given day. Now, another place, and I certainly don't just say this to flatter you, Kyle, but is your news roundups at the Libertarian Institute. I go there every day. I think if you're interested in foreign policy, Kyle does a fantastic job of gathering up all the important stories. It certainly helps to make my own workload a little lighter, so I can check what you've collected before I go and cast my net totally wide over the whole internet. And a third thing I would say is it doesn't hurt to check out the news wires at Reuters and the Associated Press. And there you'll just find an endless list of breaking stories and updates. And so there's so many other places, but I think if you just keep up with those 3 or 4 suggestions, that will generally keep you well informed. And we can get into more news outlets in a sec here too.
Absolutely. I would just like to add, well, first, thanks, Will. And I think I cast a pretty wide net when I look at news. I actually look at Jason Ditz and antiwar.com last just to see whatever I miss as a kind of test to myself to see if I found all the important stories. Because Jason Ditz certainly makes sure he has every important story up there on antiwar.com every morning for us.
Yeah.
But I find Twitter to be very helpful. I follow AP and Reuters and Middle East Eye, Gareth Porter, Sky Horton, antiwar.com. All of these people are always tweeting out, very significant news stories all day long. And it's a good way, I think, to catch all those stories that usually would go missed by most media. I also find news aggregation apps to be helpful. Google has a good one. There's also one called Flipboard. Yes. However, if you're going to use something like that, you're going to need a lot of what me and Will are about to talk about nets, and that's vetting sources, because sometimes on these kind of news aggregation sites, you end up getting just personal blogs from some lunatic in his basement. So, so Will, how do you vet a source, or how do you go about interpreting news from a source?
Sure. Well, I can start with a story, then I can get to how do you vet a particular story, then I'll get to the source. And so this might sound almost overly basic, but I don't think a lot of people do this. And so an easy way to verify a particular story is just look around and see if other outlets have covered it. And if they have, figure out if those outlets are basing their articles on the same source, or if they have extra corroborating information. That's a great way just to basically check and see, is this story legit? Now, another way to easily gauge an outlet's leaning, a particular news outlet, like if they have a bias or a spin, is look at their editorials. Like, what kind of commentary does this outlet run? Especially their in-house editorials. And so if it's a newspaper, they'll have the editorial team actually take an issue or take a position on a particular issue, or even back a candidate. And so this gives you a good idea of the sort of the institutional leaning of the outlet. But you should always remember that particular outlets may differ here, so, keep that in mind. But otherwise, I think it's best to form your opinion of a news outlet on sort of a long-term, ongoing basis. If you think you found an outlet where they've gotten it right over and over again, you might want to stick with that one. That's why I particularly like antiwar.coms, because I see them getting it right, over and over again, year after year.
Absolutely. And even, other sources, you'll understand the bias. And so you'll know maybe Al Jazeera will be honest on the Syria situation, or will be honest on probably Libya would be where I would trust Al Jazeera the most, or in Israel. Where I wouldn't trust them would be a situation like Syria, where I said I would trust them. That's where you wouldn't trust them because they're involved with the rebels there. Or previously they were pretty bad on the Yemen situation because they were involved with Saudi Arabia there. And so just knowing the news source and like where you could trust them from reporting and where you can't. Because a state outlet like Al Jazeera, if they're reporting something bad that would be beneficial for the state of Qatar, then you could kind of trust that may be more of a real story than a story that's a fluff piece for Qatar.
Exactly, and you ought to really be careful about state-owned media. We have governments, you have government-owned media in a lot of these countries, so you should be wary of those sources.
And the other thing, a good hint I picked up actually from Scott Horton's wife, Larissa, and I wish I could say her name. I think it's like
Alexandrovna.
There you go. Thanks, Will. She has said that one of the most important things, especially today, is just to look at the byline and look for somebody like a Gareth Porter or a Will Porter or Philip Girardi or Eric Margulies, because then you know who's writing this. And, when you look at big publications like Reuters or the AP, they will just reprint news from other sources and stuff like that. And so you may not, have any idea who the person is. And usually just by Googling that person's name, you could get a pretty good hint and feel at maybe what their bias would be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, focus on individual authors. I think that's important too, for sure.
All right. And do you have maybe a short list of, other than antiwar.com and my site and Libertarian Institute, of just other names or names of sources that you would say, like, these are places that you feel confident using as sources for your own writing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. As you said, I've mentioned Anti-War, the Libertarian Institute, Reuters, AP, etc. But also, there's a site called Consortium News that has been absolutely indispensable in my mind. There's a guy named Robert Perry who's in charge over there, and he's a great investigative journalist. And I've lost count of how many amazing stories they've run at Consortium News, just in the past year even. And they've got great, commentary and analysis too. It's not just news. Another one is called Mondo Weiss, and this is great for mostly Israel-Palestine news and commentary. Now, Mondo Weiss, most of the authors there are progressives or liberals, and that's kind of the same with Consortium News. But I'm a pretty radical libertarian, and I still get a lot out of these websites, so I suspect your viewers can too, sort of regardless of their political views. And finally, there's some great sort of analytical sites that I've learned a lot from. So in that regard, check out AfghanistanAnalysts.org. That's Afghanistan-analysts.org. And a site called southfront.org, which has a lot of good detailed coverage of the Syrian war, among other things. But those are some, just a handful of sites there.
Yeah, and just to add to that last list, Moon of Alabama is one that I really like for some kind of inside scoop and technical stories of what's going on in the issue.
Yes.
Are there any sites or just types of stories that you tend to stay away from?
Yeah, I think I would say so. Now, your mileage may vary with sites like these, and they're certainly not all completely bad. But generally, I would say to stay away from kind of conspiracy sites. Now, again, I don't recommend that you judge things entirely based on the outlet. I tend to look more at the author. But having come from more of a conspiracy kind of background myself, I've learned that it's very hard to trust sites like this. But if you're going to read a site like that, you may want to do as I suggested. Look around for other outlets to see if they've covered the story. Something you'll find at conspiracy sites a lot is that there's like this it sounds like a major explosive story, but you'll find that nobody else has talked about it. And so given the nature of the internet where things spread around very quickly, it usually means there's something off about that story if nobody else has covered it. You know, if it was legit, you could kind of bet other journalists would be eager to get their write-up on it. But that's just a sort of procedure that you should run through. There are times maybe when a site might just be the only site with the story. So, you know, just be careful, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever I read like a big news headline, let's say there's I read a headline that says there's a chemical weapons attack in Syria. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and Google Syria and see if one of the first news stories to pop up is about that chemical weapons attack. Exactly. And just to make sure, if nobody else is reporting on it, that certainly doesn't mean that it's not true, but that means I need to start digging to find somebody else who's saying it, because you really don't want to just go off of one post, especially if you don't, have any particular reason to trust the source.
Right. I mean, there are posts like that are a dime a dozen, man. It sounds like it's some fantastic, explosive news, but there's just nothing ever comes of it. It's totally, baseless.
And there are sites like Zero Hedge that you could go to, and they're usually one of the first people to pick up a story, and maybe they'll be kind of on the riskier end, a little chance at a little bit more than I would be willing, as if a story would be true or not. But they provide a lot of details and a lot of links, so at least if there is something big going on, I would certainly go maybe to a site like Zero Hedge first to see if they're doing like a live update of the situation.
Yeah, Zero Hedge is great. That's one I left out of my list. That's a good one.
And also Twitter does a pretty good live feed too, so if there is something going on in Syria, go and search Syria on Twitter and just see if, people are tweeting about it. There are certainly a lot of Syrians on Twitter that will be out there saying, hey, there's a giant poison, cloud of smoke over my house if that's the case. That's a way I get a lot of news out of Yemen is just by, I follow some people who live in the capital there, Sana'a, and they, will report and have pictures of like the airstrikes and what's going on.
Yeah, Twitter is actually a great place, man. I mean, even like big stories have been broken on Twitter. There was a guy in Pakistan who was reporting about the Bin Laden raid before it was even officially announced. He's saying, whoa, there's a bunch of helicopters flying around here in his village or something. And he actually had broken this big story before the media or the government did.
That's crazy how, we're now in 2017 and Twitter's breaking the big stories.
Yeah, and villages in Pakistan. Yeah, it's crazy.
And as Twitter breaks big stories, one group in the media that is becoming, in my opinion, less and less credible and fashionable, and that is the mainstream media. So what is your overall opinion on the mainstream media, Will, and what do you think about using them as sources?
Well, I'm as cynical as anyone is about the big, mainstream outlets. And by mainstream media, I mean like print outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post, or big TV outlets like Fox or CNN. People don't always define what they mean by mainstream media, but that's what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, I do think we still have to kind of use the mainstream media. I mean, these bigger outlets, they do have, more manpower, they have more resources to throw at stories. And I think you'd kind of be limiting yourself if you just totally shunned the mainstream media, like didn't read anything out of the New York Times.
Absolutely, because I don't have the funding to send Will to Iraq to go and report on the front lines and tell me, how many people are really dying on the streets in Mosul, how many bodies are there, how many bombs are hitting. And in places like Fox News and Reuters have that ability. And so for now, I think the only way to get some of those stories is through those, sources.
Yeah, that's right. And the way I look at this, I kind of see as like the mainstream media will break a big story, and then you should wait, because typically the alternative or the independent press will then kind of confirm or refute or correct certain little aspects of that story. And so often the big outlet will get a big portion of the story correct, but then the independent media comes and fills in the blanks or the omissions or corrects the errors in the spin. And I certainly don't recommend that you trust major outlets. You should be extremely skeptical, but maybe just kind of use them as placeholders until you can kind of corroborate what they're reporting.
Absolutely, and the perfect way to look at that is what we were talking about first with the Seymour Hersh article. I think you alluded to that. We could talk about that later on, and just how the mainstream media did accurately report on April 4th that people were dying from chemicals in Syria. That did happen. Now, the rest of it was all lies, but, just under 100 people did die in Syria from breathing in gases, and so it was, through the progress and the reporting from later on that we found out the truth of the situation, but I think that's a pretty good example.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a misleading story, like the best, if you want to call it the best misleading story, is like 90% true. but some aspect of it is spin, so that kind of gives it some credibility. But that's what I think the alternative media is for. The independent press comes and corrects that, 10% of spin or lie.
Absolutely. And the spin is really so sneaky too. If you look at the spin in Yemen, they preface every article, on Fox or CNN that the Houthis are Iranian backed. It's always, bots in this proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it simply isn't true. And yet everybody who then reads the story is reading it through those colored glasses, and it's just quite amazing how those little one-liners really do it.
Right, they add up too. Next thing you know, you hear Secretary of Defense Mattis talk about how Iran is destabilizing Yemen and using that as an example, and people just accept that. But the first thing was never proven. It's never really been proven that they have a significant involvement there with the Houthis.
Yeah, there were a couple good ones over the weekend. The first one was Nikki Haley coming out and saying, well, everybody knows that Russia meddled in the U.S. election. And it's like she just read the headline over and over again and just believes it's true now without any actual proof. And this is somebody within the State Department, high level, that just doesn't get it. And then I also read a CNN story. And I think this is kind of a Ministry of Truth kind of thing that they did. And it was about the new Space Corps that could be approved through the new NDAA. Right. And in the text of the article, it said nothing significant had ever come out of an NDAA before. It's usually a boring bill. And that's amazing because the NDAA is where Congress approved indefinite detentions of American citizens or approved to send man-pads to Syrian rebels. So
right, but nothing important there.
Yeah, unbelievable that they could just gloss over the history of this horrendous bill with one sentence in what's supposed to be the most credible news outlet in America.
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
And then the last thing, sometimes I will ask for questions in the foreign policy focus group. So if anybody's ever interested in asking anything on the show, join the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. You can ask me a question. Will's in the group. You can ask him a question there. And it's a cool thing you could do to talk about some foreign policy stuff. But Adam wanted to know if there's any tips or tricks for just identifying a bad source or outlet other than ones you had already mentioned. Maybe just looking at URLs or anything on the website itself.
I'm not so sure about the URL aspect, but I could think of one additional piece of advice would be to look and see if the story, who are they quoting? Who are they citing? Are they citing nameless officials? Or are they citing, if it's a story about Syria, are they citing rebel activists, like who are in favor of the opposition? So really look and see who the story is actually quoting and sourcing. Because sometimes they'll use they don't expect you to know that the source is very biased, but if you know about that source, then, it gives you a good idea about the quality of the report.
Absolutely. And that's just part of understanding the foreign policy in a broader picture too that I think is helpful. If you know what the ambitions of maybe the Syrian Kurds are, then you may understand why a Syrian Kurdish general would make a certain claim to the press or something. Whether it's true or not, you may be able to better interpret that by if you know their ambitions and goals.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, do you have anything else you want to add on this topic?
No, I think we covered everything.
All right, great. It was awesome having you on. I really enjoyed it. Let everybody know where they can find your work, where they find you on social media. Plug away, Will.
Sure. My name's Will Porter. I'm a journalist. I'm a staff writer at a site called the Daily Sheeple, where I do news and commentary 5 days a week on weekdays. You can find me at www.thedailysheeple.com. My personal blog is at tlvanguard.wordpress.com. You can find some of my other viewpoint work done at antiwar.com and the blog of the Libertarian Institute. And I don't think I said my Twitter handle yet, which is WKP ANCAP, ANCAP.
All right, thanks so much. Well, I definitely recommend following Will on Twitter because he does post all of his work there, and so you can catch it that way. You can find both me and Will at the blog at thelibertarianinstitute.org, and you can find my work at kylesfilesblog.com and foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Thanks, everybody. Please share the show.
Take care.